Welcome back. To shift from Islamic thought's reflections on Iblis, which was the topic of our last lecture, to Christian scholasticism of the High Middle Ages may seem like a recipe for some sort of intellectual whiplash. But as I tried to say last time, in fact, the later history of Christian thought is pretty impossible without Islamic thought. In the past half century or so, scholars have really come to appreciate the vast intellectual debt that Europe owes to Islam. It wasn't, in fact, as the book's title suggests, the Irish that saved civilization. It was, in fact, Islam. When Western Europe was trying to put itself back together again after the collapse of the Roman Empire, it was Islam that secured civilized life in the Mediterranean and also secured the transmission of Greco-Roman classical antiquity to the Latin West, largely through the gathering together of these texts in their Greek and Latin forms and their translation in Islamic, Arabic-speaking centers of learning in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, places like that. So, at that point, once that Western heritage had been secured by Islam and then began to be transmitted back to the Latin-speaking West, it was really the Latin-speaking West that needed contact with these literatures again. The intellectual discipline that begins to be known as Christian scholasticism emerges. Soon after the end of the first millennium, Christian intellectual culture in the West began to mature institutionally and intellectually. Theologians began to teach in cathedral schools, in schools associated with particular cathedrals. In fact, they created these schools associated with the cathedrals. And various religious leaders, leaders of monasteries, bishops, religious intellectuals of sorts who developed followers in the West, became important thinkers in their own right. There was a large-scale renaissance of monastic intellectualism at this time. And as this went on, pre-Christian Greek and Roman thinkers were rediscovered, and more attention was also paid to Jewish and Islamic thought as well. Much of this work served to develop and systematize Christian thought beyond the achievement of Augustine, still considered by all these intellectuals the great Christian Latin thinker, the greatest thinker of the West. For them, because of the painful severing of ties with the Greek Christian East, for mostly political reasons, it began to be almost entirely a Latin Christianity that people in the West understood to be the central conveyor of the Christian heritage. Now, as the intellectual conversation expanded in those first couple centuries of the new millennium, right, from 1000 to 1100 to 1200, very slowly, a network of medieval think tanks and schools developed. First associated, again, with cathedral schools and then monasteries, and then slowly as kind of freestanding institutions of learning, modeled importantly, it seems to be the case now, on Islamic centers of learning in Cairo and Baghdad and elsewhere, centers of learning that were understood to be the kind of proto-universities of the world, right? The intellectual and institutional context that emerged in these universities, the style of teaching and learning that emerged there, is something that we have come to call scholasticism, the thought of the schools. Now, before I go on, let me just give you a taste of how scholastic teaching and learning went forward. Scholastic teaching and learning was really mostly about the development of skills in public debate. This is an interesting fact. Most of the learning was not really contained in books per se. The books were repositories, records of debates that were held in public before the students, and that students could be involved in by asking questions. But effectively, what scholastic learning was the mastering of a huge body of traditional information, the development of the skill of summarizing that body of information and being able to articulate it in its most potent expressions, and then the ability to take that body of information, kind of like an intellectual juggling act, and learning how to debate the various sets of tensions and conflicts that emerged from within that body of knowledge. One of the most important texts of medieval scholasticism, and one of its earliest, in fact, one of its most prompting texts, is a book by Abelard, an early and very controversial medieval scholastic intellectual. He wrote a book called Sic et Non in Latin, that is, yes and no. And he effectively simply gathered together the entire tradition of Christian thought that he could get his hands on and demonstrated that very respected, very important authorities, ecclesiastical authorities, intellectual authorities, philosophers, theologians, bishops, councils, the scriptures, at different times, every one of these authorities could be heard to be saying something on both sides of an opinion. Abelard was like the nightmare YouTube of his day. He recorded everything he found. And when he did, he created enormous tensions, intellectual tensions, in the world of Western Christianity, because he pointed out that the entire system was incredibly filled with what looked like contradictions. In a way, Abelard's provocation of the tradition really effectively generated the history of scholasticism, because it began to be a system to figure out how to make sense of the fact that very intellectually serious, very authoritative people were able to take seriously and with sincere truthfulness claims that were effectively contradictory, and the tradition had to figure out how to make sense of those claims. Now, one of the things that this focus on a particular body of knowledge requires, and the form of intellectual debate demands, is a very, very precise, at times very abstract, but always extremely intricate kind of reasoning. Scholasticism is in this way sort of like the work that you would expect an intellectual jeweler to do. It's still today, by philosophers and theologians, recognized as enormously philosophically impressive work. Some people still think it was the worst kind of mere academic gamesmanship, about debates about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin or something like that. But in fact, when you look at the debates, what they're debating in the context of the moment, they were in fact enormously impressive in the seriousness of the matters that were handled and the precision of the debates that were undertaken. I think it took until at least the 20th century to rival these thinkers for the sheer brain power and the care that they did with their work. Now, two of the greatest of the thinkers of this tradition were unarguably Anselm, who also became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Thomas Aquinas. Anselm is not exactly a scholastic. He's a bit too early for the full maturity of scholasticism, and he himself was never per se a university teacher. But his thought served as one of the main ingredients of mature scholastic theology. Aquinas is often considered the greatest mind in the scholastic age, and not without reason, although he himself was, we can say, fairly idiosyncratic. For our purposes, though, they both, most importantly, developed interesting and powerful analyses of evil, deriving from Augustine's work in some important ways, but influenced by other philosophical currents. And they used these philosophical analyses to ask some deep and abiding questions about the origins and nature of evil. They each offer, then, searching discussions that pertain directly to the matter of our course. What an evil act is, how it is intelligible as an evil act, and how it is also not ultimately intelligible. Most centrally, they investigate the mystery of wickedness by exploring the study of the fall of the devil and the nature of what Aquinas will end up calling the infernal compact, the agreement among the demons to work together, not centrally by addressing the experience of human malice. And this is a deliberate decision on both of their parts. By treating of their discussions of the fall of the angels, the fall of the devil, we will be able to look at their understandings of agency in what we can call a relatively hydroponic manner. That is, we will be able to look at their discussion of the roots of agency as we would be able to study the roots of a plant that is growing in water, with no soil clouding your view. Both Aquinas and Anselm deliberately focused a lot of their attention on the nature of the evil will, on the fallen angels, the devil and the devil's minions, precisely because for them it seems to be cleaner study of how agency can go wrong than looking at embodied humans. Embodied humans have lots of motivations that can obstruct and obscure things. I mean, both of them thought about the nature of the human fall. But to figure out the core essence of what happens to a free agent when it freely chooses evil, they both thought that looking at a disembodied angel and the disembodied angel's rebellion and fall would be a cleaner and crisper analysis of this. I think they were right. And in this lecture, we're going to explore first the logic of Satan's rebellion through the thought of Anselm, and especially one of Anselm's most influential treatises called On the Fall of the Devil. And then second, we're also going to look at what we could call the moral psychology of the devil and of communal evil via a series of works by Aquinas. Now, Anselm, in his very brief treatise on the fall of the devil, it's really only about 25, 30 pages in an ordinary paperback book size. When I teach this in my classes, though, we spend normally 3 weeks reading those roughly 30 pages, 10 pages a week, because it is extremely dense stuff. This work explores the nature of Satan's motivation for rebelling against God's providential order. It unpacks the multiple dimensions of misery that befell Satan because of that rebellion. And all of this is in the purpose of summarizing a picture of the relationship between good and good and evil creatures, and the longings and desires of good and evil creatures in the cosmos. Much of the treatise in general can be summarized in a very pithy statement that Anselm offers during it. He says that Satan basically wanted everything and got nothing, while the good angels sought nothing and received everything. Let me quote this for you because Anselm's Latin is really quite tremendous. The angels are separated between those who, adhering to justice, that is, those who stay with God, stay with what is due them, enjoy all the goods they wish, and those who, having abandoned justice, those who have rebelled, lack any good they desire. Right? Now, the pursuit of one's own good on one's own, that is, without reliance on God or your colleagues, your neighbors, your friends and relatives, is both radically self-deceptive about who one is, most fundamentally because one is a creature of God. Thus, one needs God's assistance in being at all. And secondly, is radically self-deceptive about what one's true good is. Namely, it is loving dependence and relation, sharing in God's community, not solitary self-mastery. For Anselm, God creates the whole universe and gives all the angels, all the creatures within it, but he's focusing on angels here, remember, a good will, a will to participate in the universe. But, Anselm says, each of the angels must on their own actualize that will. They must make it their own. They must inhabit the will, endorse it. The mystery of the devil for Anselm is that the devil inexplicably chooses not to accept that will, but instead seeks something more. The moreness of this more is a really interesting puzzle, and Anselm is quite psychologically acute about this. What is the nature of the more the devil seeks? Well, in a sense, it can't be specified because any particular specification would be obviously insane. The devil only wants more, a generous but completely general and vague ambition. When I teach this with my students, I love to use an analogy to a movie they've never seen, but hopefully some of you will have seen this, or if not, go and watch this movie. It's the old classic movie Key Largo with Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart. There's a wonderful scene when Bogart and Bacall are facing some gangsters. And Bogart says of the gangster leader, Johnny Rocco, he says, "I know what Johnny wants. Johnny, you know what you want?" And Rocco says, "What?" And Bogart says, "You want more." And Rocco says, "Yeah, that's right, I want more." And it's left completely unspecified what it is. And then Rocco turns to Bogart and says, "What do you want?" And Bogart says, "I want a world where there are fewer Johnny Roccos." That's a very Anselmian moment. Because the problem with a figure like Rocco, the problem with a figure like the devil, is precisely that the ambition that they have is so vague and so general, it can never actually specify in any particular way about the world they live in. The devil's desire, evil desire, Anselm is saying, is endless and bottomless just because it is impossible, just because it can never be specified and thus can never be sated. An analogy here is useful. The analogy would be with lies. It's easy to tell one lie, but the activity of lying is effectively bottomless because there's no proper place to end lying. At any moment when you're lying, it always can seem to make more sense to tell just one more little lie, but each small, minute lie makes you that much worse, in that much worse of a situation. Yet by the time you get into lying, you're so far into it that the cost, the psychological cost to you, in my experience anyway, check this with your own experience, the psychological cost to you of owning up to your lies, all of which, each one of which is maybe the size of a small grain of sand. But the psychological cost is the cost of the whole pile of sand, the whole amount of lies. So it always feels easier to tell just one more lie. And that's Satan's problem. It always seems easier for Satan, on Anselm's account, effectively to try again to imagine a world where the vague desire he wants could be sated, even though the very fact of longing for this world is precisely what makes Satan miserable. Remember, the good angels accepted what they got, and they were happy about it. Satan actually makes himself miserable precisely because of his ambition. Now, all this is, it seems to me, a relatively dense but quite philosophically profound picture. It's also, though, for Anselm, as I said, 30 pages. This is a very pithy argument. Can we get a more unpacked, less dense picture of this? I think we can, actually, in the work of Thomas Aquinas. Now, Aquinas lived about 2 centuries after Anselm, century and a half, let's say. And he is probably the greatest intellectual that the West has known in between, I would say, Augustine and pick your modern hero. For some people, Kant, for some people, Hegel, who knows, Picasso. Aquinas, though, is an enormously powerful intellect, and he was famous for being able to do the activity of scholastic juggling, scholastic intellectual juggling, more effectively than anyone else. There are famous stories of Aquinas actually literally writing 4 or 5 books at once, like one of those chess grandmasters who you'll find sometimes in parks in New York City or elsewhere, who can play 10 games at once against 10 different opponents. Aquinas would sit in a room or stand in a room, and he would have 5 or 6 scribes around him. And he would dictate a sentence to one scribe about one of the books he was writing, and then dictate the next sentence to another scribe for another book he was writing. And while those scribes were finishing their sentences, he would go over here and dictate other parts of other books. We actually know this is true because we have records, and there's a really fascinating way that we can tell he was actually commenting on a series of Aristotle's philosophical ethics texts at the same time that he was writing in his Summa Theologiae, this vast work. The questions, the chapters, they're questions really, the part of that work which is on ethics, on the virtues. And at the same time that he's doing that, writing a commentary on Aristotle, writing the Summa Theologiae on virtue, he's also writing a commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. In other words, he's doing multiple books, and not like an hour on one book, an hour on the other book, an hour on the third book. He's literally writing them sentence by sentence simultaneously. That kind of intellectual juggling requires a certain kind of mind and a certain sort of skills that are acquired by training that are pretty much lost to our world today. Aquinas was an enormously impressive guy. Now, for anyone following in a broadly Augustinian line on evil, as Aquinas was, the difficulty is, as Anselm showed us, how do you present the mindset of an evildoer? What does a wicked person's mind report to itself that it is doing when it is doing evil? Remember, we talked about for Augustine, the nature of evil, the nature of willing evil is a kind of absence of reasons in some important way, and yet the appearance of those reasons to the person who's doing them anyway. But this raises this real puzzle. What does evil feel like? Or more accurately, what does it think like from inside? And this is a profound and interesting effort at empathy towards something that we really shouldn't feel empathy towards. Not because Augustine and those who followed him, like Aquinas, wanted to feel pity for wicked doers, but rather because they wanted to get as clear as possible about the inner logic of evil's rationales, not least to help ourselves avoid thinking in this way when we are tempted so to do, to help ourselves from becoming such rationalizers of evil. Now, consider Aquinas' representation of the satanic psychology. He has a wonderful description of what he thinks it was like for Satan to have convinced himself that he was going to get somewhere in rebelling against God. And this is mostly around Aquinas' glossing of the idea that Satan wanted to be like God. What does it mean to be like God for Satan? Let me read you this passage here. One may desire to be like God in a way that is not natural to one, not natural in the sense of not appropriate, not fitting for one, as if one were to desire to create heaven and earth, which is proper to God. There is sin in this sort of desire, right? Now, what's interesting here, what's in the background here, is that Aquinas has to agree that there would have been a way to want to be like God that is appropriate. And why is that? Because all rational creatures are supposed to imitate God in some way, at least in the exercise of their reason. So the idea that humans and angels are supposed to be like God is not in itself a terrible idea. The problem is how they are going to be like God. Okay? So I continue here. It was in this way that the devil desired to be like God, this bad way. Now here's Aquinas making a very crucial distinction. Not that the devil desired to resemble God by being subject to no one else but himself absolutely. Right? That's not what the devil did. And why didn't the devil do that? For in that case, he would be desiring his own not being, since no creature can exist except by holding its existence under God, receiving its existence under God. In other words, here he's saying the psychology of the devil can't be that nuts to desire that directly and self-consciously you want to be separate from God is to mean that you would say to yourself in a very explicit way, God is the source of being. I want to resist God. I want to resist the source of my being. I want to die, right? On some description of what rebellion against God is, Aquinas is saying, if you actually think it through properly, you will come to the conclusion that that kind of rebellion is nothing more than a longing for suicide. which is precisely why Satan doesn't want to come to that conclusion. That sort of direct desire is impossible for Satan. He can't form that thought in a coherent way. So we continue with Aquinas. But rather, it was in another way that Satan desired to be like God, by desiring as his ultimate end of beatitude something that he could attain by the power of his own nature, right? Desiring as his ultimate happiness something that Satan could get on his own, turning his appetite away from the supernatural beatitude that is attained by God's grace. That is, so instead of thinking, well, I want to die, the devil redescribed the end he was seeking so that he could now imagine achieving it on his own. That's one possibility for what the devil was doing, right? If you won't make me lunch, then I will go outside and I will just eat the grass. And I'll be happy with that because you won't do what I want you to do, or you won't let me do what I want to do. That's one option for what the devil was doing. But Aquinas gives him another. Or, if he desired as his ultimate end that likeness of God that is bestowed by grace, right? If he still desired beatification and likeness of God, rivalry to God in some sense, if, that is, Satan wanted to live in a world where the combat myth was true, he sought to acquire that likeness by the power of his own nature and not from divine aid, as God ordained. Now, this again is really important. Here, Aquinas is saying it's possible for the devil to keep the end of ultimate happiness in his head as an idea that he will still try to attain. But now he will convince himself that he can get it by his own efforts rather than receiving it from God as a gift, that he would reach out and grab it rather than accepting it as a gift. Now, all this, it seems to me, explains the nature of evil as a kind of desire, one kind of desiring to be like God and not another. It explains the character of Satan's motivations in rebelling against God. There's a resentment that God is higher than Satan, an envy at that superiority, and a desire to be like God, all of that slathered over with a kind of self-deception, an ability by Satan to convince himself that he in fact can get to what God is. And this explains for Aquinas also the nature of the allegiance of the infernal creatures with one another. That is, this helps us understand the moral psychology of communal evil. All of the angels, all of the fallen angels work together in a way, but each one for their own private good. Each one pursues their own solitary end. Each one wants to be their own God. So it's a kind of alliance of egotists, which makes it a very unstable alliance. Now, all of this is interesting in itself in Aquinas. But it also, and he means it to do this, it also illuminates the nature of human evil and the curious kind of collegiality it can provoke in its adherents. For there is a certain kind of collegiality among the damned. Aquinas is in no doubt about this. But the collegiality, the false community of the damned, is only the false community of those who each individually are seeking their own private and wholly individual, wholly solitary good. Now, this is an important moment because here we touch on a metaphysical conviction of the pre-modern world. One really beginning with Augustine, but having many roots before that, a metaphysical conviction of the pre-modern world about the nature of evil, which it will be very differently seen in the modern world. And that is the connection between the Latin term privatio and evil and its relationship to the category of privacy in our world. For the Latin theologians, the word privatio And there were other words in other languages that could do this too, but let's focus on them right now. Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, all the people in the Latin-speaking West. Evil is most of all privative, like depriving reality of being in some way. But it does this by shrinking back from being connected to the rest of reality. In other words, evil is an attempt to be private, to be alone and on your own. For Augustine and Aquinas, these people thought that the notion of radical privacy, radical solitude, or radical self-possession and possession of our own property is actually theologically problematic. Augustine's monastery was a monastery where no one held anything privately. Everyone held all goods in common. Aquinas, in being a Dominican, lived in an order which was committed to poverty and to refusing the goods of the world insofar as those goods were to be held by them as possessions of their own. Both of them thought that the notion of private property or private being were ways of participating in a certain kind of practice which inevitably leads to evil. This is really interesting in comparison to our world, and it strikes, I think, it identifies, I think, a pretty profound tension between the pre-modern world and the modern world, because we believe deeply in privacy. We believe deeply that each person is an individual who should be left in some fundamental way alone, or should be allowed to be alone. We believe, that is, in a picture of the ideal character of the human that Anselm, Aquinas, Augustine, a lot of these pre-moderns, we'll see Dante saying something similar in a little bit, would have thought sounded a lot more like the satanic psychology than it did anything appropriately Christian or normative. I put that out there just as a thought to keep in mind as we go forward here. There is, in fact, a really profound way that these earlier thinkers really challenged not just some of our beliefs, but the very way we've organized our society, politically, socially, culturally. For them, the society itself looks like it's a society, in a strange way, that Satan designed. Okay. I like our society, by the way. I'm not suggesting that we need to be rejecting it. I just think there's a really profound tension between this picture and our own. So let me wrap up here. The scholastics were always dense and elusive. All their thought is hard and needs time to unpack. But we begin to see what Aquinas and Anselm were about in untangling the sorts of semi-plausible pictures of human motivation, pictures of desire that are not immediately and obviously absurd, even if they are absurd in their ultimate incoherence, from ideas that would be patently absurd, obviously absurd, even to falling angels. Anselm and Aquinas, for all of their scholastic abstruseness, for all of their scholastic intricacy and difficulty, give us some of the deepest, most realistic, and most profound pictures of the role of self-deception and illusion in the exercise and the agency of evil that we have yet encountered. Now next, we're going to turn to a figure who offers an even richer and more vivid account of evil, working with the thought of Anselm and Aquinas, but on a far, far grander canvas, and that is Dante.